Perth to start the program, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Matthias Cormann. Matthias, thanks for your company as well.
Good to be here, Peter.
First question, if I can, Senator. Front page of the Australian, Solomon's offering itself up as a Pacific solution. What do you think of that idea?
Well, Labor has made a complete mess of their border protection policy, and of course what Julia Gillard should be doing is she should pick up the phone to Nauru. Nauru is willing and able to take refugees on behalf of Australia, and of course they were a very successful part of the Pacific solution under the Howard government. And in fact, I know that the United Nations Commissioner who was here earlier this week said that the Howard government Pacific solution was much preferable to what the government is pursuing now.
All right, free kick out of the way. Let's get on to Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott. What's going on there? Why on earth is Malcolm Turnbull authorising Warren Entsch to do something as stupid as send out an email to the entire lower house party room, which is always going to leak, which is always going to upset Malcolm Turnbull, and which at the end of the day looks ridiculous for the leader as well, because it turns out Tony Abbott missed some of the same votes that Malcolm Turnbull has been attacked for?
Well, look, making sure that all of us turn up to votes in the Parliament is a job for the whips.
Why didn't he put Tony Abbott's name on that list?
Well, I mean, all of us, whether from the most newly elected member to all the way up to the leader, we've all got to turn up to all the votes. And I might just point out here, I'm in the Senate, of course, and in the Senate, if any of us miss a vote, we've got to come into the chamber and explain to everyone why we've missed that vote, which of course is a very public way to go about it. When I first became a senator 4 years ago, the first thing the whip told me, as soon as those bells start ringing, as soon as that red light starts flashing, you start running, son. And of course, that's what I've been doing ever since, and so far so good.
A couple of years ago, the bells rang 5 separate times for a pretty important vote. It was the $42 billion stimulus package that then leader Malcolm Turnbull was boldly opposing. That's become a pretty strong cornerstone of opposition policy economically. At the time, Tony Abbott, he'd had a few drinks, he'd had quite a number of bottles of red wine with some mates. He was asleep on his couch in his office. He missed all 5 of those votes. He slept through them. When the bells rang there, he obviously didn't learn the same lesson you did, Senator. He didn't go running.
Well, I mean, all of us have to, make sure that we get to all the votes. But I mean, the important point to make here, though, is like in the normal course of events in the House of Representatives, the government of the day has got the numbers comfortably, and the opposition will always lose every single vote. But this Parliament, of course, is very different. There, every single vote matters, and of course, if we want to stop bad legislation from going forward into the future, then our best opportunity to do that is in the House of Representatives. So the discipline for everyone to turn up to every single vote in the House of Representatives, unless they've got separate arrangements with the whip, is very important indeed. Because in the Senate, of course, the government will have the control together with their alliance partner, the Greens, as of 1 July.
So, Senator, there have been other tensions within the coalition over the last week, over the fuel excise, over Joe Hockey claiming that he was hung out to dry with the family tax reforms he was proposing. Is this all evidence that Tony Abbott is perhaps more popular within the Australian community than he is within his own party?
Well, Tony Abbott is very popular within his own party. He's an outstanding leader who will make an outstanding Prime Minister. But of course, the biggest issue this week wasn't anything to do with the coalition. The biggest issue this week was that Wayne Swan was found out deceiving people about what he knew and when he knew about the West Australian decision to remove a royalty concession on iron ore fines.
Senator, we'll get to that in a moment, don't you worry. But before then, I just want to give Malcolm Turnbull's former Chief of Staff, Chris Kenny, a chance to offer you a question. If I recall, Paul Chris here lost his job partly because you, as one of the senators, resigned from the front bench, moving towards Tony Abbott. So with that introduction, let me hand over to Chris.
That is I think, as Chris might well remember, I resigned from the front bench because I wanted to vote a particular way in the Senate against the emissions trading scheme at the time, and of course, that is the position that is now party policy.
Matthias, I've erased all memories of that from my mind. So, look, what I wanted to speak to you about today, Matthias, was the Western Australian Premier coming out today and saying that he's virtually, in terms of economic development in Western Australia, he looks to China now, and that China is where the action is. Now, in one way, of course, that's very understandable, but in another way, it just shows that how much tension there is between Western Australia and Canberra at the moment.
Well, I mean, obviously China is very important for the economic development of Western Australia. I think that everybody would well understand that. The problem that we've got is that we've got a government in Canberra that just hasn't got a clue about what's going on in Western Australia. And, I mean, the Treasurer acting like a spoiled brat this week and threatening to remove infrastructure funding from Western Australia just shows how he misses the point. The economic success in Western Australia is actually in the national interest. Investing in infrastructure in Western Australia is in the national interest. And for Wayne Swan, just because his incompetence on the mining tax has caught up with him, to threaten to withdraw GST, withdraw infrastructure funding, I mean, it is just exactly the wrong way to go. And so from that point of view, I completely understand where the Premier of Western Australia is coming from.
Isn't that part of the problem for the coalition this week, Senator, that you had the government on the ropes over the tensions with WA, over its inability to prosecute the carbon price, and the last 3 days' press have been dominated by internal ruptures on your own side?
Well, I mean, I don't control what the press finds interesting. So, I mean, all we can do is pursue the merits.
You support the outing and the public disciplining of your colleagues. Isn't that an internal matter that really shouldn't see the light of day?
No, what I said is that discipline in the Parliament and making sure that everyone turns up to votes in the Parliament is a matter for the whips. And what I've just pointed out is that in the Senate, of course, where we've got a long history of having to make sure that we all make it to every single vote, we actually, if we miss a vote, we've got to front the Senate and explain to the whole Senate as to why we've missed that particular vote. And of course, that is a much more public and a much more embarrassing way of having to deal with for those of us who get caught up in that circumstance.
Senator, you're on the front bench, you're far more senior than the whip, but if you found yourself as the whip, would your strategy be to send all emails, or would you do things privately?
Well, I'm not the whip. I think that Warren Entsch has got a difficult job. Like, we've got some very important pieces of legislation coming up that are bad policy for Australia. And, of course, we need to make sure that we're all ready once we've convinced enough crossbenchers of the merits of our argument. It would be terrible if we lost the vote in the House of Representatives just because one or two of our own people didn't turn up.
Senator, just on those issues of policy, we've seen a number of issues where the federal government's been looking to work with the states on various issues, from health reform to this issue of gambling. Now, do you think that there is going to be a consensus from the Liberal and National parties to stamp out gambling during television programming and sporting events and the like?
Well, I mean, the problem is that you say that this government wants to work with the states. Well, I've certainly not seen that, because on the issue of health reform, essentially the government wanted to take a third of the GST away from all of the state and territory governments, without actually putting sufficient additional federal funding on the table. And, of course, that whole deal fell apart earlier this year because, again, Western Australia was supposed to hand over 60% of its GST, whereas other states were supposed to hand over 30% of its GST. On the mining tax, for example, the reason we're in the mess that we're in is because there was no conversation with state and territory governments at all. How a federal government can think they can reform resource taxation and royalty arrangements without actively engaging with the states and without actually reaching agreement with them, not just with the three big mining companies, is just beyond me.
Senator, last question on that before we let you go. I wanted to hone in on that. You've written an opinion article for the West Australian. You've attacked the government over the fact that it's a bizarre situation where a $2 billion hole can be punched in the federal budget over the forward estimates when a state government, in this case Western Australia, makes a decision to up its royalties. What's the nub of your issue there?
Well, the nub of the issue is that the Gillard government decided to do a deal with the three biggest mining companies, which was negotiated exclusively and in secret with them, locking out all of their competitors and state and territory governments from the process. Yet the government, the federal government, Wayne Swan, decided to promise to those three big mining companies that all state and territory royalties would be creditable against the resources tax liability. Now, if you make that sort of promise to credit all state and territory royalties against any mining tax liability, then clearly any changes in royalty arrangements in any single state or in the Northern Territory will punch a hole in the federal budget. And Wayne Swan should have engaged with the states and territories. He should have tried to find out what they were planning to do in relation to royalties before he recommended to the Prime Minister to sign that deal. And he didn't.
Senator Matthias Cormann, Shadow Assistant Treasurer, we appreciate your company. West Australian Senator, no less, as parochial as the rest of them over there, I well know. Thanks very much for your company on Saturday Agenda. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Senator.
When we come back, we'll be looking at the first bloke and his tight relationship with the Queen.